So again, welcome everyone to CIRTL's March 2nd CIRTLcast on reflections on building a culturally responsive teaching learning community. We have a great set of panelists, and I think we'll have a really good session today. It's good to see you here. My name again is Robin Greenler, and I'm with CIRTL. And CIRTL is the Center for the Integration of Research, Teaching, and Learning. It's a nationwide network of something over 40 universities nationwide. It's in the U.S. and Canada, so I guess continent-wide. And our mission is to work with graduate students and postdocs to help them become effective, inclusive teachers and developing methods so that they can become that they can use in both their research and their teaching skills. And there's lots more that we do besides the CIRTL Network. And in fact, I would highlight that we have a series coming up this May for those who are interested in getting just the brief introduction to qualitative research. What kind of questions you ask and how do we go about getting research that's survey-based or question-based or discussion-based. So at this URL, we encourage you to take a look at the programming we have. So with that, I'd like to pass it over to our panelists today, and just so that we can get a sense of who's in the room while they start, if you could just introduce yourself in the chat window, that allows us to know who you are and see who's in the room. So with that, I'm going to pass it to you, Dennis.
Thank you so much, Robin. Thank you all for being here today. I hope that you've had an opportunity to take part in the 3 previous sessions in this series. We will talk briefly and provide a summary of talking points from those sessions in just a little bit. I do want to welcome you all and welcome our panelists. So there's me. Okay, we'll move on past me. Actually, really quickly, I am the Associate Director for Multicultural Education and Research here at IUPUI. I also am Associate Faculty in the School of Education. We have a wonderful panel of folks that are several-time members of the learning community, starting with Adrienne Seriel, who is a graduate student in higher ed here at IUPUI. And at IU Bloomington, Mr. Ryan Davis, who is actually nearing completion of his doctorate, also in higher education at IUPUI. Mr. Anand Kulanthevo, who is actually nearing his completion of his doctorate in health informatics. And then Ms. Caitlin Martin, who is nearing completion of her MS in counseling, also here at IUPUI. And they are all several-time members of our learning community here. So we wanted to begin by, we've got 2 quick polls just to get a sense of who is in the room. And so if you could very quickly just respond to this first poll regarding where you at kind of student or scholar or faculty and so forth. Okay. Looks like we've got a fair number of graduate students. I don't know if that's oh, it is. Okay, great. Thank you, Blackboard. So it looks like we've got a good amount of graduate students here, but in addition to that, we've got some faculty and staff. It looks like 1 postdoctoral student as well. So great, thank you all. And then again, to see who else is in the room, just getting a sense of what your discipline is. We recognize that there's a number of folks, including folks on this panel, that aren't necessarily STEM focused. So if you could just briefly respond to what your discipline is. Okay. Quite a few other STEM disciplines. All right, physics, chemistry, and so forth, but it looks like we've got a couple of engineering folks, and some non-STEM folks too. Okay, that's good. We'll talk about some of the challenges and opportunities within a learning community about working across multiple disciplines, what that might look like. That may come up during our time today. Great, thank you all. So Caitlin is going to provide a summary of what has taken place so far in this series.
Hi everyone. So I'm the IUPUI CIRTL Graduate Assistant, again here at IUPUI. And I've had the unique position of being involved in the behind the scenes aspect of our CIRTLcast series. So to kick off our final session, the IUPUI CIRTL team wanted to take a moment to summarize some of the commonalities from the first 3 CIRTLcasts. So some of the recurrent points that have come up in the first three in this series, the first one I want to touch on is inclusive teaching shouldn't start in college. So education is rooted in social and economic inequity and equality, as fostering inclusive teaching before students enter college is key. With regard to STEM, this means exposing students at the K-12 level to STEM. So for example, participation in STEM summer camps, meeting with STEM employers and faculty, not all of whom are white heterosexual men. The second point that we felt was important was being open to and intentional about incorporating culturally relevant pedagogy. So when people think about STEM, they often think of objectivity and validity, assuming that it's exempt from social identity, but it's not. Social identity is embedded in all course content to some degree, including STEM. Another point is fostering active learning. So being conscious about putting different types of learners together for group work, but not at the expense of minority learners. In other words, structure group work in a way that does not put the onus of responsibility on the minority learner to represent or speak on behalf of his or her demographic. Designate roles for group members to ensure equitable sharing. Another point was honoring anecdotal experiential learning as well as textbook learning. So there's no doubt that STEM is evidence-based and that peer-reviewed research is indispensable to the disciplines therein. That said, students' lived experiences also have a place in the classroom, and that should be acknowledged and validated. The fifth one that came to our attention was the importance of creating a safe space for students, both inside and outside of the classroom, in which they feel comfortable sharing information either publicly or privately. So to talk more about this has to do with establishing communication with students using multiple channels, such as email, office hours, anonymous discussion boards, or surveys. Some issues or concerns that students may relay could include an upcoming class absence to celebrate a religious holiday, or perhaps anxiety about being the only female in a group or having English as a second language. So it's important to utilize the potential of student-faculty mentorship and promote peer mentorship opportunities within your discipline through professional networks and institutional organizations. The last one is, and this came up quite a bit, just acknowledging bias and stereotypes. So everyone comes to the table with biases, and it's becoming aware of them, acknowledging them, and working to address them that really sets people apart. So being aware of stereotype threat and how that affects learners' performance, and treating everyone with dignity and respect, recognizing that traditional assessment or evaluation measures might not work for everyone.
Thanks, Catlin. So I'll very briefly talk about our learning community. We started in September 2016 in partnership with our Center for Teaching and Learning, our Multicultural Center, and our graduate office. We originally were called the Teaching for Diversity Learning Community, although after the first semester realized that a culturally responsive teaching more accurately and adequately reflected what we intended to do, our purpose and rationale, but also being mindful of how diversity as a concept, as a standalone concept, is often subject to appropriation and dilution, and so we thought that we wanted to be very intentional about what we were attempting to do and why we were doing it. So we've had, as of the close of this semester, 4 iterations of this learning community. It was created for grad students and postdoctoral scholars across IUPUI's campus. It's an opportunity for us to critically reflect and engage issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the classroom. We sought to challenge our thinking, cultivate curricular and pedagogical practices, share research and resources, and really these last 2 parts are extremely important given how challenging this work can be, supporting our collective and respective journeys as culturally responsive educators, and then how do you foster an empowering space for ourselves and then ultimately the students that we serve. So we use pre and post evaluations, but we also work through an informal channels in terms of what do the folks in this learning community need. So when we started, it was very practitioner-oriented and not as heavy on digesting and critiquing research. And then our second go-around, there was this demand for more research. And so we went that route, and folks are saying, well, that's wonderful, but we would also like more practitioner emphasis. And so we've really tried to develop a more hybrid approach where we're digesting research, but we're also applying that to some real-world practices, pedagogical curricula, and so forth. And so I'll start by asking, and you can see some of their comments that we had sort of set up for you, but I'd love to hear from folks on the panel about how this learning community has shaped your dispositions toward inclusive teaching and learning.
Yeah, I'll start. So this is Ryan Davis. So I'm a PhD student at IU and IUPUI in the higher education program, and so there's really three, I think, kind of buckets which the learning community shaped my thinking around inclusive teaching and learning. One of those ways is I think I've become more proficient with my language, so my linguistic choices, and understanding words that I've already been well acquainted with and used, but just had an opportunity to workshop that language and break them down in ways that make understanding them and how they've been characterized and used more complex and more clear in a lot of ways as well. So that would be the kind of the first bucket, is that I think I've become more efficient and proficient with language. The second is that I think I've become more comfortable with workshopping ideas and practices of inclusive teaching and learning. So we'll have often kind of exercises where we break up into, we kind of do minute papers where we might reflect on how we might handle a certain situation, and then we might practice certain iterations of how we would approach a particular situation and talk through how that might work. And then the third is I think I've become more comfortable engaging opportunities for productive educational moments. And so that is if someone perhaps someone in our group may have said something that might have been problematic for a variety of reasons or one single reason, I think I've developed a sense of comfort to address and ask questions to learn deeper about the individual's thoughts, and you know, maintain a comfortable environment for unpacking, you know, after understanding what was meant, why perhaps the thinking or language was unproductive on some level. So those are the three kind of skill sets I would say that I've gained from participating in the learning community.
Thanks, Ryan. Adrienne or Anand or Catlin, would you like to share? Anand?
Okay, so if you don't mind, I'm going to kind of go off of that. I see two of my takeaways sitting on the slide. Is that all right? Okay. So the first one is that found that the concepts of diversity and multiculturalism are fluid, and that's something it was very nice to learn here, because what changes all the time is what is diversity, what is multiculturalism, how can we be more inclusive and multicultural. And I've also noticed that we have sort of learned how to scan the environment to figure out what diversity is in various situations, because what diversity, I should say, culturally responsive teaching is in different situations, because depending on the classroom you're in, the situation, depending on who you are, in fact, that culturally responsive teaching can mean many things. And I see it primarily as the responsibility of us educators to try and adapt to teach in a culturally responsive fashion. The other thing I have learned through this is that of course, I'm in a STEM discipline, health informatics, which is computers applied to healthcare. And I first thought, I walked in, I thought, well, we're not going to learn anything that I can try and do. Unfortunately, it turns out I was wrong. And I learned several ways where at least I could try to integrate more culturally responsive teaching and learning, and a couple of which have been adopted by the faculty who have talked to me about the situation. So we're all pretty happy in this department with it.
Adrienne or Catlin, do you have any thoughts in response to this question? Adrienne, go right ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry about that. So yeah, I think some of my key points are the self-reflection and the issues of power, privilege, and oppression were some key takeaways. I'd just like to explore that more because for me in particular, I've never been in the STEM field, but I think this learning community has been great and really helped me understand, you know, again, like what does like learning look like and how does learning occur in different disciplines, and it still, like what Anna was mentioning, like the issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion still occur in those spaces. It's just how do we kind of engage in those opportunities through that learning. So even though I might not teach them, it's really given me a good understanding of where my students are coming from, or even like how can I also approach my learning if they're, you know, the teaching they get don't necessarily address issues of diversity, equity, inclusion explicitly, but again, how can we still engage in those topics? So I think that was a really key takeaway that I learned from the learning community. And then, as I mentioned too in the slide, it says self-reflection is definitely key. I think even though I've been in spaces a lot of the times to talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, it's still important to really engage with other people to understand where they're coming from in terms of these concepts, and also looking at myself too in terms of how does that impact me and the community around me. So I think those were really great opportunities through this learning community.
Thanks, Adrienne. And Catlin, you wanted to say some words as well?
Yeah, I'll speak briefly on this. So again, I'm the CIRTL graduate assistant here. Coming in, one of my responsibilities was to co-facilitate this culture responsive teaching learning community, and I kind of came into it thinking, you know, I am white, heterosexual, upper middle class, like what could I possibly have to contribute in this space? And so, you know, one of the ones that I've listed here, the bottom right, cultural competence and diversity education are not just for people of color. That's been an important lesson for me. Also, to striking a balance between you know, speaking up and participating and showing that I am engaged, but also you know, standing back and being quiet and having humility to listen and to learn from other people. My second point here was in inclusive teaching and social justice, the process is as important as the outcome. You know, and they talk about the journey is as important as the destination. I am not wired that way. I'm very type A, goal-driven. I like things pretty straightforward, and this work is just not that. It's ongoing, it's messy, and I think something too that I've realized within the learning community is that, especially with regard to my race, that puts me in a position of privilege, and through that privilege, I have the luxury of being able to engage or not in this conversation. You know, a lot of people who are oppressed or in minoritized situations, they don't have that choice. And so I think just to kind of wrap that up, again, just trying to find my place within this space in a way that contributes, but also stands back and learns as well.
Thank you, Catlin. Thank you, everyone. Before we move to the next slide, which will be a bit more interactive, I want to draw your attention to the chat board where Dr. Anusha Rao had shared a wonderful resource coming out of Wisconsin-Madison on a learning community for graduate students with this work. So definitely take a look at that, and there's a link provided for you. So we're going to move to our next slide and ask our panelists and invite you all. You can type directly on the whiteboard, as Robin suggested you could do earlier, any questions or any comments that you have regarding this, or if you want to chime in as well, we'll do our best to address some of you that way as well. So we encourage your solid continuous interaction with this question. So what key concepts, resources, strategies, or practices were most helpful in developing your inclusive teaching competencies? Kathleen?
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and get started with this. I think one key idea that has really resonated with me is the importance of just creating a safe and respectful place. So, first and foremost, you never want to do social justice work at someone else's expense. And I think, too, being a counseling student just really, for me, goes to show that, active listening and empathy really do transcend the disciplines. And that I think your truth based on your identity and your experiences is your truth, but it's not the absolute truth. It's not everyone's truth. So I guess, creating a safe space, but also being able to distinguish between what's an uncomfortable and challenging comment versus what's an attack, and making space for the former.
And Adrienne?
Yeah, I think one of the really great strategies and resources or practices I think I really took away from this learning community too was, again, not being from the STEM fields, but also seeing how this can translate into my own work is, looking at curriculum or planning in general for courses, and how can we be more intentional in terms of being able to, incorporate issues of diversity, equity, inclusion there. So again, are there examples of your students in the literature? Are you being intentional in terms of the readings and the resources that you provide in the classroom? So I think I've learned it definitely takes more work, but the positives that come with that can be, even greater, because even as a student myself, once I see literature or activities that can be relatable to my own experiences, you see the the investment of the students there. So I think that was a really good takeaway that I got from this learning community.
Thanks, Adrienne. And I can ask all of you on the panel, you can respond to the question, and you can, or if there's anything in particular, there's some really good points that are being brought up in the audience, making sure all voices are heard and respected, considering current events and issues on campus, and then recognizing my own bias and not letting it come into my classroom. So if those are some things that you want to touch on, or if you just want to respond to the question in general, Anand.
Yes, Dennis. So we had a participant put down making sure all voices are heard and respected, and I believe that's an excellent point because, and I think we discussed this in the very last session during our CIRTL session, that there are some people, when you're even teaching at your best perfection for diversity and cultural response, that there are some people in the classroom who don't accept that, who don't accept these views. And I think, as we discussed, what I learned is it's not appropriate to so-called mic drop on these people to walk away, but that these people are a voice that needs to be heard and respected. But of course, we should have the aim of, educating them to know better.
You're well said. Ryan.
Yeah, I think just the ability or opportunity to operationalize terms and many opportunities to really strengthen our pedagogical imagination about what's possible. So, Carol Duick and Mary Murphy have done some research on growth versus fixed mindset. We've often applied that to students, but having a growth mindset as a faculty member or an instructor or a TA, that is thinking and knowing that your students can thrive, which is often countercultural in many STEM disciplines. Starting with that assumption, it really makes not very useful kind of weed out courses, but rather starts with the assumption that everybody was offered an admission here at this institution because we know they can be successful. So working towards those ends, and the comment that one of the participants or two of the participants kind of agreed with is considering current events on campus. I think the ability to apply concepts, strategies, and practices to what's going on in real life, what's affecting people in real time. So, the immediate things that come to mind is just current events that tend to pop up. There's many protests on campus these days. And so what are the ways in which math or science can be incorporated, or any other discipline can be incorporated to developing a critical consciousness in our teaching and learning practices. So there's a number of different ways, but I'll stop there.
And Ryan, I want to point out, in terms of specific resources or strategies, I think Ryan and perhaps someone else mentioned minute papers. Those are always an effective strategy, particularly if you are helping folks to let it out or get their guard down. You can model a tough critical question, perhaps something that's going on in the world, such as gun violence in schools, for example. And you can say to your students that this won't be shared with anybody, but at least it lets them know that their voices will be heard, or they have an opportunity to get their thoughts on paper, and that can break down some of the resistance, some of the defensiveness. Another thing somebody pointed out about the word respected, an interesting strategy to help set the stage, and it seems like a couple of folks in the chat room are talking about how do you create that kind of a space. You can use the word respect and suggest that it's not necessarily about agreeing to disagree, right? Or I don't want to talk politics. But if you break down the word respect, it simply asks that you take another look at something. So early on, during your first day of class, at whatever level that is, whatever field that is, you can set the stage by saying, we're hoping that we at least listen to one another. Just provide, and if you ask folks to do that, if you're setting it up as a central commitment, then any diversity statement that you have on your syllabus, any activities that you do thereafter will have a lot more meaning to them, a lot more critical meaning for them. So Catlin, I see you wanted to respond as well.
Yeah, Dennis, this is in part in response to what you just said, but also with adding on what you said earlier. That has been something I've taken away from this, where it's much easier to do a mic drop. In other words, to be in a situation where you feel that there's something wrong or oppressive or stereotypical or prejudice is being said. It's easy to have a very emotional response and walk away. But I think a classroom strategy that I've learned from this learning community is challenging oppressive comments with reflective, open-ended questions. Something that we had talked about too was, often the wrong response for faculty is just staying silent. So asking open-ended questions gives students the power to clarify and direct the conversation, and it's a non-judgmental way to respond. And something else we had talked about too is the difference between, this is the Dennis thing, but calling people in versus calling people out. So, taking the time to educate someone and to do it in a way that's empathetic when possible, versus just being angry and emotional out the gate.
I appreciate that, Caroline. I think it's helpful just as a reminder that it's a very contextual, conditional thing. If we have the foundational understanding that we always want to make sure that we are looking out for the folks that have historically not had their voices heard or needs met, right? That might facilitate if we're going to call out or call in. Sometimes folks, I'll raise my hand and saying there's been times where I needed to be called out rather than called in, right? And so being specific about that and just trying to work through the messiness of it, as I believe you said earlier, as a couple of you have said earlier, I think is essential to the work, right? It's not about checking it off the list or getting it just right every single time. Let's move on to the list. Are there any other pressing thoughts or anything that that folks would want to add to this question or respond to this question? Great comments by the folks in the room, by the way. Really appreciate them. Okay, we'll move on in the interest of time to the next slide. And we're going to talk about some key considerations. I won't read all the bullet points, but if there's some things that folks want to touch on in the room, these are some key considerations that we found for implementing a successful culturally responsive teaching learning community. There are some basic logistics. Folks' schedules, right? For example, we had a number of folks that could meet on one day and not the other, and so we had to split hairs, certainly during one semester session. Some of the technology issues, or actually pedagogical considerations for technology issues. One, on several occasions, Ryan and a couple other folks were zooming in, and so we couldn't necessarily do a pair and share that we would be able to do if everyone was in the room. And so how do you modify your teaching practices in the learning community based upon some of those considerations? How do you recruit folks for the program? We cast a very wide net. How do you, even when there is going to be a STEM focus, how do you create a space where non-STEM folks feel like they could be part of the conversation, they could contribute actively to the conversation? And how do you keep the content evolving, particularly when we've had folks that have come back, right? If we had a wonderful session on microaggressions, and then the next semester you've got some new folks coming in and they could certainly benefit from that session too. What do you do given that half of your folks are returners, right? How do you keep that concept fresh and integral, but not sort of do so at the expense of the folks that have already had a little bit more work with it, with a certain concept? And then thinking about structure, how can we provide activities that are not just going through the motions, but will help set the stage? How can you select articles that are getting some depth and breadth, because there are so many issues, so many concerns. I believe we touched on disability and its relation to multiculturalism for the first time this past semester. Thinking about it, and then the multiplicity of ways in which ability matters in how we think about teaching, including our technology practices. And then another consideration that we had in specifically are some demographics, right? We've got folks that not only are some students are postdocs, some students are in their PhD programs at various stages. Some folks have just begun a master's program. Some folks intend to teach in higher education. Some folks tend to teach in middle school. There are discipline and field considerations, not just in terms of what you can teach, but historical legacies of resistance, right? Somebody that is in a higher education student affairs program as at least has some of their colleagues more relatively speaking, exposed to issues of social justice and diversity and equity, as opposed to somebody in mathematics or mechanical engineering where there is tons of empirical research, but the buy-in may be different. And then what teaching looks like in those kinds of spaces, certainly in higher education, the numbers of your students and so forth. And then on top of all of that, the considerations of the multiplicities and the intersections of all of the social identities in the room. Our panelists are representative in some ways of, some are more visible than others, but the number of different kinds of social identities and the meaning making for ourselves as educators in those spaces. So those are some considerations that we've attempted to respond to, and I would love to hear from the panelists and also questions from folks that are taking part in this panel, questions that they have about these considerations. Okay, Catlin and then Ryan, please.
Yeah, so I just wanted to talk a little bit about the planning side of things. Some things that I think have worked well is we've had a Canvas course, so an online component, which has offered resources for people. It's also provided materials for our learning community sessions in advance. That's especially advantageous for people who can't be there in person and are going to be connecting remotely. Something that came up that I actually thought of after the fact, we had a session where a woman brought her infant, and I was just thinking it would have probably been better for all of us to be like in a circle on the floor or something, in a way that, again, just even the physical configuration of it would be more inclusive in that way. And then I think the other thing that I wanted to touch on was some of the challenges that we've had with recruitment. It seems like a lot of the people who would be interested in this are non-STEM people. So for those of you who are in the audience, if you have suggestions on effective ways to do recruitment, we would definitely welcome that. We've done it through the graduate student newsletter and some other venues, but that's definitely been a challenge from the logistics standpoint.
Thank you, Catlin. Ryan?
Yes, so I would affirm that the video was critical for me, being a multi-campus person. I've attended classes on both the IUPUI and Bloomington campus, and my degree is based in Bloomington, but I took classes on both campuses, so being physically present was difficult, especially with having a job on a third campus, not at IU at all. So that piece was important. I would also say that when considering implementing a learning community of this fashion, that the concept of the banking system is probably more important here than many other places. The field of inclusive pedagogy in particular is very, very young, especially at the post-secondary level. And so I think as you may know, if many of you work with teaching and learning centers on your campus, the thinking is non-existent or really brand new. And so we're identifying a number of resources, strategies, and practices that we can learn from each other. So this is not an old field. So the ability to, I think, learn from each other and recognize that there's no really true expert on this, even if people have, even if each participant and the instructors have different levels of prior knowledge, that you always have a capacity to learn. I've learned from everybody in the class, and we don't really think about who has more knowledge, prior knowledge than the other person. So just the openness to learn from everybody, I think, is really important, that concept.
Thanks, Ryan. So I see we have Anand and then followed by Catlin. And then I think we'll move to the fourth question, unless there's anything else pressing.
Okay, so I just wanted to touch on STEM recruitment being in one of those fields myself. I find that, well, with our department, because we are informatics is partly social science, we actually have pretty good dissemination of your emails, actually. They get sent out by the chair, they get sent out by our administrator, they get sent out by everyone, and students get them. The problem is, I think, often in STEM fields, I don't want to say a problem with the students, but it's the students' mindsets that they don't believe it's relevant. To even the ones who want to be teachers are just not motivated to come and try it. And I found one way to try and get around that is to have it's worked with me to recruit others into the program. And my first time I attended, I was actually recruited by a fellow health informatics student to join. And I think the last session, I was able to get someone to come for at least half the session until she got too busy with her project. So I think to get more STEM students, it's a really hard sell. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It's a really hard sell. And you might want to consider getting people who are in STEM in your program to help recruit directly.
Thanks, Anand and Catlin.
I just wanted to comment on something that I thought has been helpful this semester. So this semester I started putting together some key terms from the reading. It's not something I had done previously. You know, people come to our learning community meetings with kind of 0 to 100 in terms of their knowledge of this topic. So even things like intersectionality or positionality, terms that are used pretty commonly in this space, it's helpful just to have everyone on the same page. Because in the past, I think we've had some participants that have not felt completely at ease chiming in to ask. So again, you're just putting out key terms, but also it kind of goes back to that idea of creating this safe space where everyone's knowledge is welcome, and that you can be vulnerable and you don't have to be an expert coming into it.
To that last point, I want to make a quick plug for the concept of culturally sustaining pedagogies, right? We're talking about how the stuff is always evolving and it's not static. So the scholar Django Paris, and I believe that we looked at one of his pieces on equity by design, but he talks about culturally responsive, culturally sustaining pedagogies, building on the work of Geneva Gay and Gloria Ladson-Billings, and there's some really interesting joining practices as opposed to what's the in vogue concept. It's more about how can we be mindful of that the terminology and concepts are we're always going to work through the nuances, and it's okay to not know the newest term or to have a different stance on that term, and then be mindful that you might walk into a space and you know very well what you mean or what the research says about a term like intersectionality, but the folks in your room may have a completely different understanding of it. And so that often requires you, as much as we want to go quickly to do the work, that we often need to slow down and sit with these things in order to have the efficacy that you'd hope for it to have. Yeah.
We can't hear you, Dennis.
You know, here's a good moment where I just said some really wonderful things, but I have my microphone off, so you will all just have to trust me that I said some earth-shattering, transformative, critical understanding pieces there. Thank you, Ryan, for helping me through that. We're going to move into our fourth question, and what are the necessary or essential ingredients to foster an inclusive learning community environment? Ryan. Go, Ryan, sorry, you raised your hand.
Well, I think that Thomas Nelson Laird, as we can see this table in front of us, Tom Nelson Laird produced this. He has a couple of journal articles about it, and he's at IU in the higher education program, this inclusivity continuum. But he borrowed from Lisa Latuca's work, who I believe is at the University of Michigan, I believe, and who took these elements of teaching. In every course, you have these basic elements: purpose, goals, content, foundations, learners, instructors, pedagogy, environment, assessment, and adjustment. And there may be even more, but these are the basic course structures in her curriculum book. So building off that and other past scholars' work who has done work on inclusive pedagogy, or multiple people have called it different things and it's varied in kind of slightly different ways. But he took that body of work and put it on a continuum about how we need to move from just simply preparing students, this idea of just preparing students, and then preparing them to actively engage in a diverse society. So are we graduating students who are racially illiterate, just don't know how to interact across different races or ethnicities? Or are they are they critically conscious? Do they really know how to engage the pressing issues that we face as a society today when they're enacting or performing important work, like being judges, doctors, lawyers, engineers, scientists? Are they doing things in the most critically conscious and humanizing ways? And so what this framework allows you to do is kind of think through all the areas in which you can work on I think trying to improve on them as an individual instructor in its totality might be overwhelming, but at the very least focusing on a couple of elements where one could think more deeply about how they're constructing their syllabi, for example, or how they're inviting people to office hours. If you want to talk about inclusion, where are you having those office hours? Are you encouraging? Are you saying that, you know, go see the TA first, or are you still inviting? There's a lot of different ways in which you could think about this work. So, and even when it comes to content, you know, you could teach science or you can teach people science, and think about the learners that may have a variety of interests. So you know, there's research out there about the science of natural hair, for example, which, you know, might be attractive to those who use natural hair products. Or, you know, you have the science of makeup, the foundation, and how that always hasn't worked for different complexions or hues of skin color. So, you know, Rihanna, for example, has found a way to use science for making blemishes work well with different melanins. So there's a lot of ways in which you can think about diversifying your content even. You know, when you think about discrimination that happens with taxi services in New York City, we have a faculty member at Purdue, which is where I work, who does math around the distance between the frequencies and distances between whether somebody is denied service and those kinds of things. So if you're raising a critical consciousness, and I think this continuum allows you to think more deeply about the buckets under which we work as instructors, then I think that's a good start for thinking about some of the ingredients. So I'll stop there with that.
Thank you, Ryan. Adrienne, Catlin, Anand, any thoughts in response to this question or to extend upon what Ryan has shared so far?
Actually, I'll keep going. One more thought while my colleagues think of some points. One is, you know, if we think about the cognitive load that is associated with wondering if, you know, you think about stereotype threat, Claude Steele's work, and microaggressions, which is Sue's work at Columbia. There's a cognitive load that's associated with a lot of, and there's a lot of educational research about this too, about students who function and learn in STEM environments. There's a cognitive load associated with that. Am I going to be accepted? Can I learn as the grasp materials quickly? Is anybody judging me? You know, even there's been research done about even when white students are, say, you know, as a reminder, Asians perform best on math, for example. When that consciousness is in their mind, white students do worse. So, you know, it's trying to find ways to empower students, going back to what I was saying earlier about a growth mindset instilled within faculty members, not just encouraging students to have a growth mindset, that they don't have a fixed mindset, but faculty members that have one as well.
And it looks like all three other panelists have some words to say, and I want to point out that Carol Dweck is the first to tell those that have appropriated her research as a version of deficit thinking or grit approaches. She will be the first to tell you that that was not her intention, that she is talking about positive reinforcement and plasticity of brain development for learning, and she is not advocating that we don't look to structure and equity and so forth. So, but yeah, just something to consider. So we've got about 10 minutes left. If Anand and Adrienne and Catlin in that order, so starting with Anand, some brief comments on this question.
Yeah, so the necessary or essential ingredients. I also really like this framework, and especially that continuum left to right. And one thing I noticed looking at it is that it also reads very well, really from the bottom left corner to the top right corner, in my opinion. Because, you know, as you're towards the bottom, it's understanding yourself as an instructor and trying to convey that to the students. But as you get to the top right, I mean, that's what the real goal is, right? To make students competent in dealing with a diverse society and themselves being culturally responsive to others.
Thanks, Anand. Well said.
And then for me, just really briefly, I think one essential ingredient I always consider in terms of creating an inclusive learning environment is opportunities to engage in dialogue, just so that, whether it be pair shares or small group discussions, I feel like there's always a chance to do that in the classroom so that people can share their own lived experiences. And I think that is a great way in terms of validating people's different lived experiences, their cultural backgrounds, and things of that nature. So it can hopefully create more inclusive environments, as I was mentioning earlier, in terms of even also considering how can we incorporate different backgrounds into the readings or your activities in the classroom as well.
Adrian, I think there's so much power in what you just shared, and it's one of those places where if it's not done with nuance and delicacy, where we can perpetuate some stuff. So being mindful for all of us as educators, even in the college classroom, if you have limited representation and you want to increase voice and representation, to how we do so we're not isolating or makes folks to be the sole representative of a certain social identity that they hold. But nonetheless, not shy away from that challenge so that our silence does not render itself a stand. So well said. Catlin, and then we'll move on.
Yeah, just a couple quick comments when considering, necessary or essential ingredients to fostering an inclusive learning community environment. I think we all need to understand and frame this as, cultural competence. It's an opportunity, but it's also an imperative, particularly within the classroom. And, trying to create a space that is culturally neutral can make it seem like students' experiences aren't relevant to their education. And so, one of the takeaways that I discussed earlier was this idea that, empirical evidence and anecdotal evidence are important. I think another thing, too, that came to mind for me as, a necessary ingredient was considering the practical aspect and also how to apply what we're talking about and what we've learned. So for one of the iterations of the learning community, we had done a drafting of a diversity statement. So that's just an example, but kind of coming up with concrete ways and things that people can walk away with so that we're not just in theory land and we have some real application.
One of my favorite moments in this learning community is when we had done that session and Ryan, soon to be Dr. Davis, suggested that the questions that we were using to write the diversity statement were inherently problematic. Now, we didn't avoid doing the activity, but it was encouraging that even in that space, even when we had a tangible project to accomplish, that we should sort of think on these things a little while and asking if the questions that we are using to help us map out our own diversity statement are worthy of what our diversity statement should be. So, and I think that speaks to the folks that are on this panel, and then folks that I noticed that Jennifer Robeson is taking part in this session. Jennifer, I believe, was part of the very first learning community session. So, hi, Jennifer. So that's been pretty consistent throughout. So that has been, I think, one of the best part of this experience. Of folks that are good critical thinkers, they're engaged scholars, and they truly have all wanted to work to make a more culturally responsive classroom environment and for the outcomes that a culturally responsive environment can provide to schools and society. So I thank you all deeply for that. Do we have any questions from folks in the room in response to any of the responses from the folks on this panel? Because we're running out of time, we've got about 5 minutes left. So are there any sort of pressing questions or comments that folks in the room would like to ask or add? Okay, I just tried to model not letting silence happen, which is hard to do in a classroom sometimes, but also in the interest of time, we will move into our wrap-up. So we began today by talking about the 3 previous sessions regarding inclusive teaching in STEM. We provided an overview of the IUPUI culturally responsive teaching learning community. We continued that with a discussion of how the learning community shaped dispositions toward inclusive teaching and learning, exploring key concepts, resources, strategies, and practices for developing inclusive teaching competencies. We discussed key considerations for implementing a successful culturally responsive teaching learning community. And then, most recently, establishing necessary or essential ingredients using Thomas Nelson Laird's framework to how to foster an inclusive learning community environment. So I would like to take this time to thank the panelists, Anna and Adrienne, Ryan, Catalin, for participating. I'd like to thank Robin and Anusha for helping to moderate so the technical aspects and the background work here, and for sharing some resources. I'd like to thank all of you who took the time out of your, I'm sure, hectic end of semester, end of quarter schedules to take part in this series, and for any of the sessions in this series that you've taken part in so far. And I will leave you, and I believe this will be able to be shared, but I'll just leave you with some of the resources that we used in the learning community to get a sense of some of the depth and breadth. So we're looking at culturally responsive mathematics teaching, looking at whiteness, knowing ourselves as social justice educators, teaching from an intersectional perspective, reducing the gender achievement gap, and so on and so forth. How does some of the challenges being an instructor of color in diversity education classrooms? What are some of the things there? So I hope that this was informative. I hope this was helpful to all of you, and I look forward to hearing about all the transformative critical work that you all continue to do at your respective institutions. So thank you all very much for taking the time out today.
And please do take a moment to fill out our survey, our post-event survey, to let us know what worked for you, and so we can, as we're creating these in the future, we can incorporate more of what's working for you all. Thank you so much, and thanks very much to Dennis and Anusha and the rest of you at IUPUI, and for a great series. Thank you very much.